Welcome. I'm Ann McCreary, the program specialist here at the Library of Virginia, and I'm very pleased to welcome Robert Nelson today, who will be discussing the digital resource Mapping Inequality, Redlining in New Deal America. Robert K. Nelson is the director of the Digital Scholarship Lab and head of digital engagement in Boatwright Library. He is the editor of American Panorama, an atlas of United States history, which includes Mapping Inequality, Redlining in New Deal America. American Panorama received the 2019 Roy Rosenzweig Prize for Innovation in Digital History from the American Historical Association and was named a Tech Innovation by the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2016. Mapping Inequality received honorable mention for the 2019 Garfinkel Prize from the American Studies Association's Digital Humanities Caucus. Other digital history projects that Nelson has developed include Mining the Dispatch and a remediated, enhanced version of Charles Paulin's 1932 Atlas of the Historical Geography of the United States. Nelson teaches courses related to anti-slavery and slavery in the United States and about the digital humanities. This event is part of the library's programming related to our exhibition, House to Highway, Reclaiming a Community History, which is on view here at the library until February 28th. Check our calendar of events online for more details on upcoming programs here at the library. And now I'll hand it over to Rob.
Thanks so much, Ann. I want to first thank you and Ashley and everyone at the Library of Virginia for inviting me to be part of this and for putting together that great exhibit. I was able to attend the recent symposium, which was spectacular, and the exhibit's really great too. So if anybody in the audience has not had a chance to go down and see that exhibit, I really highly recommend it. A little bit of kind of like outline and description of what I'm going to be talking about today. It's a little bit different than what Anne was characterizing. I will be talking about redlining at the end, but I actually want to talk on a little bit more broadly about Jackson Ward and Carver to the east of Jackson Ward, all using maps. And I will touch upon redlining at the end. But I first want to start with some new work that we're working on environmental and health disparities in American cities in the 20th century, with obviously a focus today on Carver and Jackson Ward. Then I want to briefly talk about urban renewal and its impact upon Carver and Richmond, and then I will pivot and talk a little bit about redlining and race and real estate at the end. So, in some ways, like this is a kind of smorgasbord of different topics, using maps to talk about these two African American neighborhoods, historically African American neighborhoods in Richmond. But I do want to stress that these aren't exactly isolated incidents, and I kind of hope what you take away from this is that I'm going to be talking about these different topics, but they're all part of a broad pattern that involves the devaluation and demolition of neighborhoods where African Americans lived, and this is definitely a story where Richmond is in some way typical. This is not an unusual story nationally, and we're going to approach it, today, obviously, with kind of focus on Carver, but I do want to gesture Carver and Jackson Ward, but I do want to gesture more broadly to the broader patterns across other U.S. cities. So, okay, let me jump in and first start talking about environmental and health disparities and some work. Let me preface that actually by saying, this is new work. It's not quite online yet. It's work that I'm doing with my colleagues at the Digital Scholarship Lab, and beyond that, with some collaborators at other institutions that I really should mention. So the primary investigator on this project that I'm going to be talking about is Helen Meyer, who's an epidemiologist at the University of Michigan. And then we're working also pretty closely with geographers and researchers at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, which is a DC organization that does a lot of work around affordable housing and the Community Reinvestment Act, and just really trying to do as much research and advocacy around under-resourced neighborhoods as they can manage. So let me start with, let me first start by making sure I'm sharing my map screen. Okay, so I'm assuming this is going. If you are not seeing a map of with with Carver Elementary at the beginning, somebody give me a heads up, but I'm going to proceed assuming that this is working. This is I'm just got Google Maps open here to the satellite view, and I wanted to begin with George Washington Carver and the highway, right? So George Carver Elementary is an elementary school in Richmond. It is 90% of the students at Carver are African American, and I think the stat is that 98% are of color, right? So there's, I think, 1.6% of the students at Carver are white. So in that respect, it's pretty typical of what's an unfortunate reality of Richmond schools, which is really, really pronounced segregation. But what I want to draw your attention to spatially here is the proximity of Carver to that highway that's at the center of this all this programming in this exhibit. I-64 95 running just immediately to the northwest of Carver Elementary. And I want to kind of put even a little bit finer point on this. So I'm just going to measure the distance from the basketball court to the highway. So this is coming up at 290 feet. So just about 100 meters, right? And that's actually kind of an important number. That's a really heavily trafficked freeway, obviously. I think I looked it up at one point, and I hope I have this number right, but don't. It may not be right, but I know that tens of thousands of cars go by there, and I'd seen the number that the average day is 150,000. Though I'd want to check that. So this is heavily trafficked roadway, and like, what impact does this have on the kids that are playing on this basketball court and on this playground? So I know I'm an historian, not a epidemiologist or someone who's got a public health background, though I do work with them. But I've done a little bit of reading on the subject of called traffic-related air pollution, and there's a little subset of that research that's focused on traffic-related air pollution and proximity to schools. And so this is one of those pieces. And I wanted to just kind of show the graphical abstract for this, right? So what they claim here is that, or what they found with their evidence, is that for every 100 meters farther from a major roadway, participants they had 29% fewer reported asthma symptoms, 37% less healthcare utilizations, 20% less likely to report poor asthma controls. And just another visualization of this is this is a graph that they have, which shows that, if you're like 100 meters from major traffic, that has like a pretty significant increase in the severity and the number of days that children suffer asthma attacks, and then that drops really steadily as you get more distance from a major roadway. But that 100 meters is exactly what we were seeing at Carver. These kids are really close and exposed to a lot of air pollution, and there's no reason to think they do not have they have any kind of different outcome than what these researchers find, which is that it exacerbates asthma incidents. That's today. But I want to kind of jump back into the past and talk a little bit about a project that we're working on that's about health and about environmental disparities at mid-century, so about 75 years ago. But disparities that certainly had an impact upon people that are alive today, and we can begin to study. So what you're looking at here is what's called it's a collage of Sanborn maps. I won't get into that too much. Sanborn maps are these really incredibly detailed fire insurance maps that were produced by a company called Sanborn for about 100 years. This one is from representing Richmond and Carver specifically in 1952. So we can zoom in here, and there is George Washington Carver, which is a brand new school at that point, and we see the realities of 1952 Richmond and 1952 America. Underneath it, it notes parenthetically, this is a colored school. This was Jim Crow America, right? Where we pretty much have segregated schools today, but the de facto segregated schools. This was de jure segregation, where this was a school that was exclusively and entirely African American. And there is no interstate, obviously, right? The interstate is yet to be built, is about 10 years off at this point. But I want to point out, actually, let me go back really quickly. I meant to show this. So, like, there's this interesting circular concrete pad that's visible on the map still today, visible on the satellite view. And like, what is that thing? We can see what that is on this map, which was a gasometer. It was part of the Richmond City Gas Works. Gasometer was a really big industrial structure that held manufactured gas, and that manufactured gas would have been used for like streetlights when gas powered such things. This was obviously kind of on its way out in the 1950s, but was still there and still about like 10 years from uh, uh, being removed, being dismantled. And the point I want to make with this is that like we see this pattern where kids at George Washington Carver today are exposed to traffic related air pollution, but that is not like a new reality at all. In 75 years ago, they were just a stone's throw away from this gasometer, which was one of the more kind of toxic sites and kind of pieces of industrial infrastructure in 20th century America. And it's not only that, like if we look a little further beyond that, we have the Sunshine Laundry and Dry Cleaning Company, which would have been another kind of major site of industrial pollution. Dry cleaners today have mitigated the kind of chemicals that they use and are a little bit, or I think substantially actually less environmentally uh, poisonous or toxic. But 75 years ago, there would have been a site that was using some really, really aggressive chemicals and had a pretty poisonous impact on the surrounding environment. And they're not alone. Across the street, there's a number of junk yards. If we look a little bit up to the northeast of this would be north of this, kind of just proximate, sitting between Jackson Ward and Carver. We have the coal company, which has just got a bunch of coal piles sitting out there. Next to that is the city dump. Between all these things, between the coal piles, the junkyards, the city dump, is another institution, African American institution, the Mount Zion Baptist Church Colored, right? So the point I want to stress here, and the point of this project, is we're interested in mapping the environmental and industrial landscape of about 60 American cities, Richmond only being one of them, to better understand the kind of spatial inequalities that impacted health, right? So this gives you kind of a micro view of how these major sites, industrial sites, were located in Carver and next to Jackson Ward, one had a deleterious impact on the quality of life and the health of people living there. But I want to zoom out and show that this is like not an isolated, not a unique by any means. So I'm going to kind of turn this on. So What you're seeing here is a map of both population density and then racial racial demographics in 1950. The census tracts from 1950. So the darker the color, the more population is in those areas. Let me turn the legend back on. And then the more purple it is, the more it's a population of color, and the more green it is, more it is white, right? And we see the really sharp distinctions of segregation in 1950 Richmond, with Jackson Ward being uh, really, really dense population and almost entirely African American. And no surprise, like the areas that where the African American population lived, Jackson Ward, uh, North Churchill, are the places that had the most proximate exposure to the major sites of industrial burdens in the city. Okay. Yeah. Now I want to pivot. This project actually grew. That the project on industrial burdens emerged from a different project that we did. It was really kind of a small project, but I think kind of an interesting one that we did 5 years ago, really at the outset of the pandemic. And we did this with the same folks that we're collaborating on now. This was in some ways our first collaboration. And what we were all reading about in the paper was how COVID was hitting Black and brown neighborhoods more severely than it was white neighborhoods. And when I'm really mostly thinking about Helen Meyer, the epidemiologist, kind of wanted to begin to kind of understand and contextualize that in a broader history of health vulnerability and social vulnerability. So we wrote a white paper, and we also produced this site to show spatial correlations between redlining in the 1930s and health disparities, social vulnerability today. So what you're seeing on the left is a redlining map that I'm kind of working on the assumption a lot of people on the call probably know about, but to give you a little tiniest bit of background about this, this is a residential security map that was produced in 1937 by a federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. And what HOLC did is they sent out field agents to every city in the U.S., or almost every city in the U.S. had a population of 40,000 or more. So it was about 230 cities, a little north of that. And they had the field agents work with local realtors to develop security maps. And the security they were, what that's in reference to is the security of mortgage lending to particular areas. And so then they would have the field agents working with the local real estate experts give each neighborhood a grade on a scale from A to D, where they would say that A neighborhoods are best neighborhoods where banks can securely give loans, and those loans would be acceptable risk. And then on the other scale was B neighborhoods, which they characterize as hazardous, and essentially said that like a conservative, responsible lender would not likely to extend a 30 or 20 or 30-year mortgage to applicant in those areas, because that they didn't have confidence that those mortgages would hold their value, and they were concerned that the banks would be taking on an unacceptable risk, and that they had to foreclose, that they wouldn't get their money back, and they would so it's in the midst of the depression, so they're really worried about systemic issues in the banking industry. And between those were B and C neighborhoods, which were kind of a long spectrum between best and hazardous. And then they produced these maps, which color coded these. A, B, C, D became green, blue, yellow, red, right? And the it's the reasoning and the rationales and uh, the rubric that they used to come up with these grades was a little bit subjective, and it did factor in a lot of different uh, different pieces of information, from the age of the house to the style of the house to the availability of utilities. But one thing that really, really was determinative was the presence of African Americans. And so, essentially across the country, every African American neighborhood is given a D value, regardless of the housing stock or the class status of the people that live there. And that's certainly the case in Richmond. There's, I think, 12 areas that are given D grades, and 11 of those were African American neighborhoods, and every A, B, and C neighborhood was a white neighborhood. So Richmond's Richmond's definitely an example of the kind of racial disparities and the racial bias built into these redlinings. So, yeah, on the right is a visualization of the CDC's SVI Social Vulnerability Index, and what that is a assignment of a score from 0 to 1 that's meant to measure the social vulnerability of an area. And what the CDC uses these for is that if there's some kind of emergency, they know which areas have the kind of least resiliency and need most support. Something like a pandemic, say, right? Like, this is kind of useful in the midst of the pandemic because they could target interventions where they're most needed and are going to be most effective. And so I represented this as kind of borrowed. I think I'm on just borrowed / stole, whatever, take your pick. This scheme from a weather map, right? So using pinks and reds for places that high social vulnerability scores, and greens for those that had low social vulnerability scores, and this kind of matches up pretty closely to the redlining grades. And so what you'll see in Richmond is something you see across the country, is that the areas that were redlined on the typically on the east side of the city and around downtown tend to be the places that today have the most social vulnerability. So I want to kind of jump into, let's start with one, which is, I'm going to zoom in here, Gilpin Court, right, or North Jackson Ward, the area that was Jackson Ward, or is Jackson Ward, that was laid north of the interstate when it was built in the 50s. And this has one of the highest social vulnerability index scores in the city, and it's about as high as it can get. It has an SVI of 0.964. So amongst all the census tracts in the city, it's the one with the second highest score. And let me explain this little bubble chart here. So each of these dots is a census tract, and they're laid out between along whatever. It's often a percentage. In this case, it's the SVI. So we got in Richmond a bunch that have low social vulnerability, and a bunch that are kind of clustered and not very many in the middle. And so, like, why this high SVI? And the reason for that partly is it's the CDC, so they really do in their calculation, they weigh health conditions, morbidities pretty highly. So this Gilpin Court has almost the highest rate of asthma. Coming back to this asthma that we were talking about in the city, 15.5%, just really remarkable. It has middling cancer, which is cancer's often outlier. High diabetes, amongst the highest in the city, very high blood pressure, highest incidence of kidney disease in the city, nearly the highest incidence of mental health diagnoses, highest incidence of obesity, and high pulmonary disease, COPD. And they're not going to come as a surprise here, right? This is an area that's got the highest level of poverty in the city, 77.1%. It's got almost entirely African Americans, 97.5% minority. And this is a number I really want to draw your attention to. It's life expectancy. So the life expectancy is shocking, like appallingly broad and difference between census tracts. So in Richmond, it can vary from almost 90 years to 66 years. And Gilpin Court is not lowest in the city, but it's pretty low. It's 71.2. I want to contrast that, and then we'll come back to Jackson Ward. I want to contrast that with Windsor Farm. This was an A-rated neighborhood in the 1930s, rated best. It has amongst almost the lowest social vulnerability in the city, and about as low as you can go. It's about as close to zero as Gilpin Court was to one, 0.015. It's on the opposite end of the demographic spectrum. It's got an incredibly low percentage of people of color, 5.2%, and its life expectancy is 12 years difference, right? So this is not that far away from one another. I think these things probably like 2.5, 3 miles away from one another, and those 2.5, 3 miles make a difference of 12 years in people's life expectancy, to say nothing of the quality of life. And the poverty is the lowest in the city, less than 1%. And the reason people live longer there is because they have better health conditions. They have the lowest asthma in the city, low end of diabetes, high blood pressures in the middle, lowest mental health problems, pretty low obesity, and pretty low pulmonary disease, at least relative to other people in the city. And let's just do Jackson Ward really quick. So Jackson Ward is an interesting, obviously it's an interesting neighborhood and area, and it's kind of interesting and kind of unusual demographics today. I believe it's just north of 50% white, so it's changed and gentrified in the last several decades, and is pretty different than what it was in the 1930s, or pretty different than what it was in the 1980s. It's hard not to read these statistics where it kind of sits right in the middle of social vulnerability, almost dead middle, and kind of almost alone in the city, and unique of 0.478 as somehow correlated to the fact that it's so racially diverse, and is one of the census tracts in the city that has the kind of most balance between white and non-white residents. It's the percentage minority. I think it's lower. I think this is a lot of data. I think it's lower now. This might be from the 2010 census, because we were doing this in 2020 and I had 55%. I think that's actually dropped. Life expectancy is kind of sitting between those two things, 78 years. And we'll kind of speed this up a little bit, but the disease incidences, the morbidities are kind of sitting in between. Okay. And I want to just again stress, like the patterns we're seeing here in Richmond are pretty typical of what we see in other cities. Okay, so I want to pause for a second, and I want to kind of pivot a little bit and then return back to Carver. So let me load up a different image. This is a great and completely invisible. Let's fix this really, really big image. Let's jump up to one second, find what I'm looking for. There it is. Okay, let's take a quick look back at give me one second to locate myself. Why am I missing this? What am I doing here? Let me turn this thing off so I can see a little clearer. Sorry. Okay, there. Sorry. me a second to find. Okay, let's return this map. So we had the gasometer, we had Carver Elementary, we had off to the east all those industrial sites, and to the west of Carver Elementary in 1952 are all these little buildings that got a D in them, and that's Sanborn's, and there's an F. Those are Sanborn's abbreviations for dwellings and flats, respectively, right? So this Carver was a neighborhood that had a lot of homes in it in 1952. In 1959, 7 years later, those homes are gone, right? We see the gasometer. Sorry, mess that up. There it is. We see the gasometer really visually prominent in this image. There is Carver Elementary too, but this, everything around there, including those dwellings, is gone. So like they're just wiped clean. And now there's the interstate too, right? So we've got these three things, but everything else is gone. So like, what happened to them? Part of this was the construction of the interstate, which bisected both Jackson Ward and went to the north of Carver. But that's not the whole story with Carver. Carver was the first of the federally funded urban renewal projects that were executed by the city of Richmond in the 1950s and 1960s. So a little bit of background about urban renewal. Urban renewal was a project that went on for about 25 years, where the federal government provided a good bit of funding to cities to raise, destroy slums and address what they termed blight. And the ideas were partly like to get people into better housing, and they were partly about kind of raising the tax base for American cities. And these two things obviously were kind of in tension. These, like I said, that these are federally funded, and that's really, really important thing to note. So urban renewals projects were always proposed by and then implemented by local agencies. So in Richmond's case, they created the Richmond Redevelopment and Housing Authority, and it was RRHA that made the application to get federal funding to execute the Carver and other projects, which I'll talk about briefly in a second. And so these are locally planned and locally implemented projects. And some years ago, we did a project called Renewing Inequality, which tried to map as many urban renewal projects as we could across the country. And like there's lots of angles we could have taken to map urban renewal, but the one we picked was to focus on the people, and particularly on the families that were displaced by these projects, which are tens of thousands of families, hundreds of thousands of families over the course of the 25 years of this program. And even more particularly than that, we were interested and wanted to visualize the racial disparities in these displacements, because urban renewal, well, I can't say it better than James Baldwin did, I believe in 1955, when he said that urban renewal was tantamount to Negro removal, were the words he used. And that's definitely was true, that this fell disparately upon African American communities than on white communities. And Carver is a perfect example of that. So let me click on, this is the outline of the project footprint of Carver. And in Carver, there were 477 families that were displaced when all those homes were wiped out. 99% of those, 471 of those, were families of color. There were 6 white families that were displaced, according to the report that the RRHA made to the federal government. Right. So Like, is this atypical? It certainly is not atypical in Richmond. The Another major project was a 17th Street project executed several years later. It displaced just almost identical number of families, 481, and almost identical racial demographics. 95% of those were families of color. Slightly more white families, but still a really small number, 20, 25, or 5%. Um, Richmond executed a few more urban renewal projects using federal money. So one of those, two of those were conservation projects. Partly because of civil rights protests and activism against the racial disparities and the impact of urban renewal on kind of destroying Black neighborhoods. There was increasing emphasis upon preservation and conservation towards the end of those 25 years of the program. But that doesn't, just because they put conservation and preservation and don't report displacement, doesn't mean these don't have a dramatic impact and dramatic toll upon these neighborhoods. And it's by no means a coincidence, and it's really important to note that like both of these neighborhoods, Randolph and Washington Park, are historically African American neighborhoods. So with the exception of downtown, which is obviously not a kind of residential hub, all the projects in Richmond like targeted some of the most prominent African American neighborhoods in the city. A couple of them displaced, you know, ultimately thousands of people, hundreds of families, and even those that didn't, wreaked a pretty severe toll uh, on those African American neighborhoods. And so I want to kind of zoom out now here in a second. But let's just kind of, this is a national map. This is using the same color scheme that we're using in our project on industrial burdens. So the more purple it is, the more people of color were displaced by urban renewal projects. The greener it is, the more white families were displaced. And so each one of these dots is a municipality that got federal funding and executed a project that displaced some families. And so the biggest one is New York with 29, almost 30,000 families. Chicago had 23,000, and I'll get into Richmond. Richmond has, comparatively few, less than 1,000. But obviously a much smaller city. And you get a sense here too of, there's a lot of purple on this map, right? That there are places for sure that where the majority of families were white, but particularly the more further south you go, where there is higher concentrations of African Americans, the higher the percentage of people of color. And to kind of drive this point home, I want to switch the visualization a little bit. So this is looks more complicated than it is. It's just kind of a simple chart where on the left axis is the percentage of the city that was white. So the ones towards the top left are cities that were majority African American. There's not very many of them. And the further you get down with the kind of green background towards the bottom right, those are cities that are majority white. And then on the other axis is the percentage of families displaced who are white. And so there's that yellow line in the middle, which means that like any city that falls below that yellow line disproportionately displaced African Americans relative to, or people of color relative to the percentage of people of color in their city. So like down at the bottom, St. Louis County, for example, where Ferguson is, that was 97% white population, but 94% of its displacements were of color. Lubbock, Texas was 92% white, and every one of its displacements was of color. You get the idea. Like, so New York, the mostly displaced more white families than black families, 59 to 41%, but it was 85% white and 15% of color. So, relative to its overall percentage, it's several times more likely African American families would be displaced than white families. Okay. Now I want to pivot to my last last thing I want to talk about, and I want to go and look at start with the This is the headquarters on Chamberlain Avenue, just in Gilpin Court, Jackson Ward of the Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority, which is right next to Gilpin Court, just off of Chamberlain, right north of the 95. So Baker Street, Chamberlain. I want you to note that. This is a map that a colleague of mine found a few weeks ago, actually, at the Library of Virginia. He's Riley Champagne, and he's with another colleague doing a atlas of Richmond, and he found this great map, which is a 1917 map of the proposed extension of Chamberlain Parkway through Jackson Ward. So, like, first thing I comment upon is like this program is focused on the disruption of the highway, but that's like not the first instance where you had a major arterial or major roadway built through Jackson Ward that destroyed properties there and displaced people. Chamberlain did that 3 decades earlier, and when he showed me this, like the one thing that really caught my maybe let's place this in space. So there's Baker. This is where Chamberlain would go. And the name I wanted to draw your attention to is smack dab in the middle, J.D. Carneal. You'll also see J.D. Carneal's name down here in a couple of places on the bottom right. And it's not clear to me if that is because Carneal owned these lots or if Carneal was the property manager. So I want to kind of stress that because I don't actually know which is the case. It might have been that they were managing these properties for somebody else who owned them, or they might have been the owner. Regardless, this really caught my eye because I'd seen J.D. Carneal's name before. It's at the bottom of the area descriptions for 8 of the 12 areas that were redlined by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1930s. So I briefly talked about redlining, and hopefully you're familiar with it or got the gist of it from my earlier description. Here. Okay, so a little bit about the Carneals. The first thing, these are 2 different Carneals. So I should stress that this is kind of like preliminary work that I'm doing, and I've been kind of interested in them, but haven't found a lot of information. And there's definitely ongoing work that I want to do on this area. So this is really preliminary comments on this. But again, 2 different J.D. Carneal. So the one on the 1917 map was J.D. Carneal Sr. He started a real estate office that became Carneal and Son, and then Carneal and Sons. And this J.D. Carneal that's provided the information for the redlining area description was J.D. Carneal Jr. And this, the Carneals, their real estate legacy continues today. There's spots in Carneal is real estate office. It's down on Belmont, right north of Perry Street. And so this is like a 100-year firm that the Carneals were involved in. Okay, and like the reason I bring this up and the reason that J.D. Carneal's name on that map caught my eye is that there's this remark on. Well, actually, I'm going to show the map first, right? So this is the area description for Jackson Ward and the African American Carver and other African American neighborhoods in the vicinity that was redlined in the 1930s, and it's pretty typical. These things are not really well filled out, right? So they actually did mention that the train is rolling, but they don't list anything under favorable influences or detrimental influences. They really just kind of like the key line for all these neighborhoods was that they had inhabitants that were African Americans, and once that was done, this is basically uh, kind of stacks a deck, and these are already red lines. So, like, why bother to fill out the rest of this form in any detail? But they do offer one clarifying remark that's a kind of interesting one that I find a little cryptic, and I don't have a full explanation for it, but I still find it interesting, and I think it suggests an important point that I want to end with. Population decreasing because of demolition to save taxes, right? And the reason Carneal's name caught my eye on that map is because clearly Carneal's had some economic investment in Jackson Ward, in the early part of the 20th century. And like in some ways, it's kind of really no surprise that the clarifying remark for them is one that's really from a white perspective. It's really from the perspective of white investors in that area. That like in favorable influences, they could have said, like, Jackson Ward is the center of Black entertainment in the city with institutions like the Hippodrome. Or it could say this was the site that had fostered a Black and entrepreneurial uh, middle class in the city and was the home of several financial institutions that were Black owned. They don't. They leave that entirely blank. What he does put down is that the population is decreasing because of demolition to save taxes. And like for me, again, this is like a really preliminary reading. Is like what the way I read this is like Carneal, probably speaking and representative of other, white landowners, white landlords, like slumlords in that area, had milked that area for as much profit as they could. They had extracted as much capital and wealth out of that area. And having done that, having bled that dry as much as they conceivably could, they were demolishing the buildings to save taxes. And to kind of come back and end on the point that I began with, like for me, this is just like 8 words, but it is they are 8 words that really exemplify a pattern that would be repeated in the destruction of Carver by the Urban Renewal Project and by the dissection of Jackson Ward and the separation of Jackson Ward from Gilpin Court by the highway. We'll put a point on it. Like that's the demolition of Black neighborhoods to serve the interest of the white community, and more particularly to generate profits for white elites. I have gone on longer than I intended to. I want to thank you for your attention today, and I'd invite you to explore these projects online if you'd like, and I am very happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was all fantastic. And we have time for a few questions. I just want to mention a few things before we move on to questions. Rob's colleague, Annie Evans, has been putting a lot of really, really helpful information in the comments. If you haven't seen that, she's also going to share a resource list with me to share out to all of you. So I will be sending that along soon. We're also recording this program today, and it'll be posted in a week or so on our public YouTube page. So that'll be available in the next week or so. Great. So just a couple of questions. This one is in regards to the environmental project. Could this methodology be applied to rural areas, such as locations near flood zones?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as long as you can find that data, I think, right? So that's we've got some methodological issues to work out for sure, and I'm not a biostatistician or an epidemiologist, so I'm going to rely on my colleagues that do have that expertise. But we're generating what I think is an interesting historical map, and often that's kind of the way I approach the historian is I want to see where these things are, and then kind of delve into the context, the historical context, the stories, the policies behind these. My collaborators who are scientists have a different approach, and they'll do some modeling with that, and we're going to have to kind of figure that out. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any reason you couldn't do this with rural areas, assuming you could get the reliable historical data.
Great, thank you. And we have a question about the about redlining and the mapping inequality project. Who was saving taxes? The property owners?
Yeah, clearly property owners. And
Mhm.
like I want to part of that also caught my eye is there's a great book I'd recommend by Andrew Carl called The Black Tax, which I read, I don't know, a couple months ago. And it's really stuck with me. It's the, oversimplified what is a nuanced argument, but the gist of it is that African Americans have historically always been overtaxed and underserved by public services, education, streets, sewers, and that uh, uh, this is at odds with and contradicts like a stereotype that African Americans have historically not borne their share of the tax burden, and exactly the opposite is the case. Andrew shows really, really clearly. Um, so, like, I, it is a kind of confusing, and I still haven't quite made sense of that uh, that sentence and what's going on in Jackson Ward in 1930s. But yes, it would be property owners, and like it makes me think. Another book I just read recently, which Bench Ansfield's book, Born in Flames, which is about uh, arson and profit in the Bronx in the 1970s. And like I think what that destruction is in some ways kind of a foreshadows and is the antecedent of what happens in the Bronx, which is the destruction of these buildings because like they've again probably milked about as much money out of them as they can, and they want to invest in things that are going to be more profitable for them, irregardless of the impact this has upon what is an already kind of dire, overcrowded, and desperate housing situations for African Americans and Richmond in the 1930s and other cities as well. Uh, so yes, it'd be property owners, and like I because of Andrew's work, I also am wondering if those are overassessed because it's an African American neighborhood, and I haven't gone into the tax records to try and substantiate that yet. But it's an interesting question.
Great, thank you. And my colleague also posted in the chat links to both of those books you've mentioned
Right.
for anyone who's interested in those. Great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have. But thank you so much for joining us today. This was really, really fantastic.